So, John,
That's right.
let me just start by saying a huge thank you to you for giving up some of your incredibly precious time to join us for an episode of The Responsible Edge this morning. You and I know, connected some time ago. I was very excited about the prospect of having you on the show. And it's going to be a great sort of way to kick off 2025 for us here on The Responsible Edge. Thank you.
And for me, Charlie. So just thanks for the invitation. And I admire very much what you're trying to do. So as I said earlier on, if there's anything I can do to support, very happy to do so.
Fantastic, John. Well, to kick things off, and I know that of all the guests that we've had on, trying to fit you and your background into 20 minutes is going to be we're going to fail at that task, really. But let's try. Touching upon, I think, the role that corporate ethics, responsibility, and sustainability has played in you doing what you've done so far in your career and what you're intending to do with the rest of it. Just give our listeners an insight into you and your background.
Well, I became interested in business and environment very early on, when I was still in my teens or even younger, at a time when that was unusual, both of those things. And for environmentalists to be interested in business was like dealing with the great Satan. So I spent 50 years professionally trying to combine both of those, then became sort of a pioneer in what we now call sustainability, came up with triple bottom line back in 1994, so people, planet, profit, or prosperity, and I, in a way, spent a lot of my life working with people who are just emergent. So initially it was getting environmentalists into business. It's easy to say into boardrooms, but I mean, at different parts of business, including boardrooms. Then it was social entrepreneurs. Then it was sort of exponential innovators. And now it's sort of anyone who might be relevant. And the number of people who might be relevant grows the whole time, which is one of the reasons I find this field so fascinating, because it's constantly changing and you constantly have to come up new learning curves.
John, a brilliant initial introduction. I know. Well, we're going to dive a little deeper, if you like, into that background. Yeah. So I'm intrigued to go back to your teens and your sort of early 20s, if you like, and you mentioning that you were an environmentalist from an early age. Can you recall for us, like, what those sort of formative experiences were like, the moments when you really realized, what your passion and what your drive was going to be for what you wanted to do with your career?
I'll try, Charlie, but it's difficult because, we all project backwards into our prehistory things that we now know. So I'll try and avoid that if I possibly can. But two things for me from a very early age became important. One of them, we traveled a lot as a family. My father had been a fighter pilot during the Second World War, Battle of Britain, and then onwards. And as we traveled, we were immersed in different cultures, societies, communities in Northern Ireland, in Cyprus, and Israel, all of them with a certain degree of conflict going on at that time. But I was really struck by wildlife in all of those different settings. And so that became important to me. But at the same time, when we came back as a family to England in 1959, when I was 9, I was sent away to a prep school. And there I started to write off to particularly American aviation and aerospace companies, Boeing, Lockheed, McDonnell Douglas, these sorts of companies, and get these extraordinary packages of information there. I think they probably thought that I was trying to buy an Air Force or whatever. But, having flown in many different planes as a family and being fascinated by my father's career, I was really interested in the companies that stood behind and created some of these new technologies. So from a very early age, I was already interested in business and technology.
And John, let me just jump in there. Were you at that time? Do you recall being concerned about the notion of the oh goodness, sorry, my dog just jumped up on me, John, so I'll have to cut this bit out as well. That was I
don't have a dog to do that, but
keep calm. Sorry about that. Yeah, were you struck by, or were you concerned by the aviation industry itself in terms of impact on wildlife and the environment at that stage, or was this far more just an interest in aviation, sort of from an engineering perspective more than anything?
No, I wasn't concerned about the impact on wildlife at all. That really hadn't occurred to me. What I was concerned about, and then 57 to 59, my father, when we were in Northern Ireland, was going off to places like Christmas Island and flying environmental monitoring missions around the British H-bomb tests. So I was concerned about that stuff. But that was slightly different. I mean, that wasn't sort of aircraft running into swans. It was the risk of nuclear Armageddon that sort of bore into my consciousness. And I think that have a lot of younger people at that time.
And John, you then mentioned how, well, in fact, please, we've got to fit in, if we don't manage to edit this in, the anecdote about your convincing of your fellow boys at school to commit 2 weeks worth of their tuck money to your initiative with the WWF, and then what you've subsequently gone on to obviously do 20 years or so sitting on their board. I've got to factor that in if I remember.
Well, let me do that in a way. I mean, there were moments in my younger life where suddenly windows opened, and one of them was when I was in Northern Ireland, and I suddenly found myself in a field on my own, aged about 7, in complete dark. There was no moon, surrounded by tens of thousands of baby eels, elvers, which were migrating, and putting my fingers down in the complete dark, having these things wriggling through my fingers, and having this 2 things happening in my brain at the same time. One, absolute panic. What the hell is going on? And then weirdly, this sort of incredible sense of connection to nature, which, even at that stage, I think I knew a little bit about the life cycle of eels and the Sargasso Sea component and so on. But then this other thing of connection. So that was one moment. And another one was when I was 11 and I was off at boarding school and stood up in front of 80 boys and asked them, really unusually, I mean, this hadn't happened previously, for their pocket money or allowances for 2 weeks, and getting it from all of them for the World Wildlife Fund. It was their first year. This was 1961. Now, I've worked with groups like WWF, specifically with them. I'm on their Council of Ambassadors, have been for about 20 years now. But so there are these moments where suddenly the future was almost seeming to reach in and try and grabbed me. And many years later, I set up a company called Environmental Data Services. This was 1978 with 2 people, David Layton and Max Nicholson. And Max had been one of the founders of WWF. And at one point, we were driving down to WWF and he said, "What got you involved in all of this?" And I said, "Well, there was eels. And then there was this weird thing when I was at school and I suddenly stood up and I was paralytically shy. I didn't do this sort of thing. And yet I did it." And he said, "I know what happened." And I said, "How could you possibly?" And he said, "Well, we got 8 pages, WWF got 8 pages into a tabloid newspaper at the time, including the front cover. And as soon as he said that, I could remember going into the school library, seeing this newspaper on a reading stand, reading it, and just thinking, oh my God, I've got to do something. So every so often, there is this sense that the future wants you to do something. There's a sort of recruiting call. You can choose to ignore it or put it off. But I think that I've had this odd sense throughout my life that there has been this call. My wife of 57 years now often says I'm a missionary, and she doesn't mean that in a good way. There is some sort of sense of mission in there somewhere.
Indeed there is, John. And moving forward, you touched on this earlier, but at this time in the formative sort of years, the influence or the inspiration of experiencing wildlife and experiencing nature, as you've alluded to there with the eels, that was the kind of the sort of beginning of the formation of your drive and determination to look into environmental sustainability. But there is ultimately that turning point when you become more interested in the social aspect, the economic aspect, the governance aspect. Can you just talk us through that transitional kind of phase and what you were doing, what you're working on? And I'd love to know, I know, you're a prolific author. When did the first, writing of a book come into play as well?
Well, I think if anyone had told me when I was a child that I would write even one book, I would have been completely disbelieving. I've now written 21. I'm working on my 22nd as we speak. But to your question, when I was in, for example, my early or mid-teens, there was no career path that would have taken you to anything other than being a wildlife warden or whatever. I had one godfather who collected animals for Edinburgh and London Zoo, but that was completely, in a sense, coincidental. So I was constantly searching for some way of bringing my interest in economics and history and society and the environment and so on into some sort of professional trajectory. And I went first to then a very radical new university, Essex, near Colchester, which while I was there blew up. And my wife's previous boyfriend was one of 3 people who shut the university down for several months. And then I went to UCL some years later to do a postgraduate degree, and that was in city planning. It was in the School of Environmental Studies. And afterwards, I always used to say that there was my education hadn't particularly prepared me for what I'd done. But I thought, oh, good heavens, the triple bottom line. I'd studied economics at university. First time around, I gave it up after 1 year. I switched to sociology and social psychology. That's the social piece to some degree. And then I went to the School of Environmental Studies. So in a way, the education has set me up perfectly for what came later. But I wasn't aware of that particularly at the time. So at no point did I feel there was a very clear career path ahead of me. And I was just incredibly lucky because even a week before I left UCL, after 2 years there, I had no sense of what I was going to do. And then suddenly in my pigeonhole, and this was a physical pigeonhole back in those days, there was a letter when we wrote letters. And it was from a small consultancy in Covent Garden called Test. And they said, come and see us. So I did, and I joined them. And so then things started. But, that was, at the time, it felt completely serendipitous. But for me, serendipity is where you make your own luck. You do things that sort of feed into the sort of invitations that come your way.
John, it's incredibly comforting, I think, for a lot of people out there that, as you so beautifully put there, that, for somebody like yourself, it's very easy to perhaps look at the credentials and the things that you've done and experienced and to sort of have that sense of it must have all been worked out from the very beginning. But to hear that even for yourself, it was about taking one step forward, not knowing necessarily whether and what it was going to lead on to, but then, being open and being aware of what opportunities did arise. That's what allowed you to ultimately end up doing what you've done with the rest of your career.
Just very quickly, there are a number of philosophers who talked about, that it isn't that you sort of got a path set for you, but as you walk, the path appears before you. And I've always had that sense in life. And so, for example, I've now served on over 80 boards and advisory boards. If somebody had told me when I was sort of 13 or 15 or whatever, you would even serve on one of these things, I would have just be completely disbelieving. And yet for me, it's been the most extraordinary learning opportunity to get inside all these different organizations, NGOs, companies, venture capital funds, and so on, and just see how it looks from inside out. Anyway, yeah, it hasn't been a straight path, and it hasn't been an obvious one very often either.
Have you? Might be a far too simplistic question to ask, but have you enjoyed it? Have you been satisfied with what you've done?
Those are two very different questions. So, have I enjoyed it? I cannot think of an alternative path through life that would have given me more pleasure and interest. Am I satisfied? Absolutely not. I've as I said earlier on, I've been 50 years professionally in this space. In exactly that period of time, the planet's wildlife has collapsed by 70%. That is a catastrophic outcome. Now, do people now talk about sustainability and more than they did? Absolutely. You've got 6,000 chief sustainability officers in different companies around the world. Well, that's a result. But the wider set of outcomes, when you look at what's happening to our climate, what's happening to our oceans, what's happening to water around the world, what's happening to biodiversity and so on, we are not in a good position. So I'm thrilled to have been able to do what people like me have done, but I'm profoundly unsatisfied. The one thing I would say, though, is that now, one of the books that had the most powerful impact on me, I read it when I was 14, Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. What he talked about was paradigm shifts. And what drives me is this sense that since the late 50s, early 60s, we have been involved in a global paradigm shift. And it started with images of the Earth from outside and so on. The thing that Kuhn said, and I periodically go back to check whether I've actually got it right or whether I got the wrong end of his stick, was that paradigm shifts, genuine ones, take about 70 to 80 years to crank through. When if you track that back, we're now 65, 70 years into that shift, which is why I think the next 10 to 15 years will see more change, for good, bad, and ugly, than the last 50 that I've been actively involved, which is why I'm really keen to be around and helping people play into that new opportunity space. I think it's going to be phenomenally exciting.
And are you, following on from that?
Yeah.
Are you hopeful?
Well, I would say, as a sort of public health warning, I was born an optimist. You couldn't do what people like me do or have done without believing that progress was possible. In fact, almost inevitable. But there are periods where that optimism has been sorely tested. And I think with what's going on with, Trump sort of wanting the Panama Canal and Greenland, and that's just for starters, you just have to think, oh, God, has it all been in vain? But again, if you go back to that underlying trajectory of a paradigm shift, what happens is very little seems to happen for a very long time. And then you get a series of inflection points. And they don't go in a straight line either, but they curve up. And that's exactly where we are now. And I think you look at Los Angeles today, absolutely catastrophic fires. Now, Trump is insane. Trump is completely delusional. But the politicians around him and people like, even, God save us, Elon Musk, they're not completely blind and they're not completely delusional. They have to see what's going on in the wider world. So I think whatever the rhetoric is and whatever the ideology behind that might be, people cannot deny reality for very long. And I think we are in a position where the natural world is sending us a set of increasingly urgent signals. The longer we delay responding properly, the more extreme the measures we're going to finally have to take to deal with them, and the more expensive that will be when it comes.
Brilliantly described. I think, and as somebody who's obviously had a much shorter career in this in the space, I even get that sense of what you described, that this is, we must be hitting that sort of final tipping point, if you like, in terms of action being taken that will have a significant effect. And there's certainly an optimism associated with that. And I think, we need to keep that optimism alive. John, let me ask you about being an author and the role that played, because you mentioned there that, as a teenage boy, you wouldn't have dreamed of writing one book, let alone 21, I think it was, that you mentioned, or sitting on one board, let alone 80. Just touch on what the inspiration was behind your first book and has driven you to write subsequent books, which I believe that your latest one was published last year, Tickling Sharks. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that was the first one that had a sort of more of an autobiographical flavor. That 75 years of life, 50 years professionally involved. So that's what this is what that was like. Where are we headed next?
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote from a very early age. Even when I was at prep school, I used to write short stories and then read them out to the boys to sedate them during the periods where I was meant to be keeping them disciplined during their sort of rest periods after lunch or whatever. So, I mean, it's always been part of the wiring, and I've always read ferociously. But to your question, the first book was published in 1980. And I'd been doing, for 5 years, I wrote for New Scientist. I did a regular monthly feature for them, initially on environmental issues, then increasingly on the role of business in that sort of space. And I'd also set up a company which I referenced, Environmental Data Services. I edited the main publication there, the ENDS report. And so I've been visiting companies around the world, and I'd been writing about what they were doing. So the first book came largely out of that. And then afterwards, I didn't know a year or two ahead what I'd be writing about. But I went into reproductive toxicology. I went into renewable energy. I went into one thing after another. And some of the books sold quite well, and others really didn't. The most successful one was something called the Green Consumer Guide, which Julia Hales and I did back in 1988. And that sold 1 million copies. And it had a phenomenal impact on the wider world. I mean, although, again, I try to be reasonably self-critical in all of this. And one of the things I've been quite good at doing is identifying building waves of change and then surfing them. So you can ride that energy and you can direct it to some limited degree, but timing is everything. So you can't claim that because you did something else happened, if part of your talent is to pick up some of these sort of impending shifts and try to get ahead of them. But I think if I've done anything over time, it's to do that, to get a sense of where the future is beginning to take us, and then take that set of messages into boardrooms, C-suites, as we now sometimes call them, and so on, certainly into the business world.
Which is ultimately, John, coming back to your point about entering, this, or hopefully entering the final stages of this paradigm shift, that actually that is the contribution that you've enabled through your work, through your writing, through the board positions that you've had, that you've ultimately enabled to provide the conditions, if you like, or contribute, should I say, to the conditions that we now find ourselves in, where hopefully significant change is on the horizon. Would that be a fair? I know you don't like sort of overly blowing your own trumpet, but would that I've done it for you? Would that be a fair synopsis of what you've done?
That's for other people to say, but I think in a way what I've done is to serve as some form of catalyst. And simply because of my background, simply because I'm not a natural shouter or screamer, people do tend to listen if I'm in a business setting, perhaps a little bit more than they once might have done to, Greenpeace activists and so on. Who were my friends? I mean, those people I grew up with, I admire immensely, could not have done what I've done without those activists and campaigners doing what they did. And really very often what I would do was not simply say, let me tell you what these people are saying and wanting of you, but saying, I'll give you some headlines about what they might want you to do next. But why don't you bring them in and I'll help you do that? And you can sit down around the table with them and listen to them tell their story. And that, when you can do it and do it in the right way, can be a very powerful way of changing hearts and minds. So, yeah, I've lowered the entry ramp for people into the world of business. But again, am I satisfied? Absolutely not. I think we're only just at the starting point in all of this.
Quite right. Well, John, we've done the brilliant thing of absolutely obliterating our timings for the show by talking about it. But as expected, and in all honesty, we could obviously just have a whole show where we just continue to explore your background and the experiences and the things that you've done. But let's move forward now. And I'd ask you perhaps just to provide a brief summary and pick out the most interesting points for you from, I think it was Lindsay Hooper's piece in September last year in the Financial Times regarding ESG.
So the Financial Times is, I think, my favorite newspaper now. And one of the reasons is that their coverage these sorts of issues, climate, biodiversity, sustainability, ESG, circularity, and so on, has been almost unrivaled among the major papers. The Economist sort of dances in and out of this space, and when it's doing it well, is doing it extraordinarily well. But the FT, I think, has been quite striking. And Lindsay's piece was basically saying that the ESG era is over. And there was an FT film called Who Killed the ESG Party? And if people haven't seen that, it's available on YouTube. I recommend that very, very highly indeed, because it's enormously critical of ESG. But at the end, it basically says, and yet we're moving into this period of time when we're going to have to do this stuff, and we're going to have to make a markets that make this stuff doable and profitable. So that is, again, part of the inflection point where we're having to reconsider what we've done to date and whether it's worked and whether it hasn't. And if it hasn't, how do we present ourselves differently in the next era of all of this? So I felt for a long time that ESG was not bankrupt. I think it was useful. But the idea of the triple bottom line back in 1994 was that you would have economic, social, and environmental. And within that, you'd have things like policy, governance, education, and so on. To put E and S and G, environment, society, and governance together, to me was muddling things up a little bit. But that wasn't the major, that was a logical flaw, but it wasn't my major concern. It was that every time you get something that is seductive, and that happened to us with the green consumer, people started to game it. People started to, the first early rounds of greenwashing happened then, because everyone wanted to be on the bandwagon and were starting to sort of make all sorts of preposterous claims, that they were taking lead out of petrol at that stage and that was saving the ozone layer. Well, hallelujah, but completely scientifically inane. And here we are again. And I think some of your work on the anti-greenwashing charter and so on is desperately important now, because we've got to have people believing, a strange word, but believing in science and trusting scientists to give a sense of what we need to do next and how best to do that. And I think the ESG thing has been a useful stepping stone, but it doesn't take us where we need to go next, which is systemic change. And one thing that's changed profoundly in my own work, having spent 50 years working largely within individual companies, from inside out, but at the same time, beating them up with green consumerism or pushes for greater transparency and reporting and accountability and all the rest of it. I now find myself realizing, you perhaps remember at school, one of the experiments that we did in physics, which always stuck in my mind, is a piece of blotting paper or piece of paper with iron filings on top and a magnet underneath, and you move it around. The iron filings go into a pattern because of the magnetic field. And the way I'm increasingly thinking about all this is that individual companies are like individual iron filings, but underneath them are these force fields like the bar magnet or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And unless and until we start to be able to play with and change those underlying magnetic fields, we're going to see these companies just trapped. And we see it. We've seen Mercedes-Benz, we've seen Ford, we've seen Volvo, we've seen Unilever, we've seen all sorts of companies backing off declared commitments on climate and so on. Why? Because the underlying magnetic fields, the market dynamics don't allow them to do that. They don't reward them for doing that. In fact, increasingly they penalize them for doing it. So again, I just think we've got to focus on those underlying dynamics. So once again, I'm coming up a very fierce learning curve on how do markets work? What are they? Where are the acupressure points that we can use to bend them to our emerging needs?
And John, that was beautifully introduced. For any of our listeners that are interested in reviewing the article themselves, would absolutely suggest doing so. We'll provide links to the piece in all of our materials. John, I'm going to massively oversimplify things here, but is the is the issue that sort of the previous incarnation of ESG, yes, you mentioned that there were logical issues around just the nature of ESG, but that ultimately it was requiring the individual company to look at this from a risk management and a reputation perspective. And it wasn't looking at the fundamental, as you've alluded to there with the analogy with the filings and the magnetic pull or the magnet itself. The market was the issue. That you can't hate the player, you've got to hate the game, if you like. So that's
precisely it, Charlie. And layered in on top of that, or confusing and confounding the picture, is the fact that we had a feeding frenzy. And suddenly everyone and their donkey wanted their own ESG fund. And a lot of that stuff was nonsensical and not worth the paper it was printed on, or whatever phrase we might use now. And now what we're seeing is a massive clear out, a shakeout in that sector. But that's how capitalism works. That's how markets work. And we'll see the same with, not just it's happening with ESG, but we'll see the same with sustainability. And we should welcome that. We should play into that. And we should be saying, yeah, if not that, then what? And how are we going to prepare ourselves for what comes next? That's what I'm trying to do myself. And I think it's a head-banging exercise at times. But there are many, many more people involved in this now, and some brilliant people now, and a lot of younger people coming in now as well, which makes me, back to your earlier question, really quite optimistic that in 10 to 15 years we can transform the landscape, despite what, or perhaps in some cases even because of, what people like Trump and Musk are currently trying to do to us.
And John, let me ask you then, this is the $64 million question, and perhaps
it doesn't go very far these days. It wouldn't even buy
what I'd have been. You mentioned that we need to see these systemic changes and markets ultimately to operate in a different way.
Yeah.
What does that look like? Like, give us a flavor of what those future markets would look like that would facilitate some of these outcomes that we've described.
Well, you talked about reputational and risk factors and how they shape corporate thinking. One of the groups that I really like is the climate group, and they have set up different platforms, one of which is RE100. And as you will know, the idea there is to get renewable energy and specifically renewable electricity to the point where it really does take off. So how do they do that? Well, initially they brought 100 companies that committed to purchasing 100% of their energy in the form of renewable energy and 100% of their electricity, ditto. That's now 400 companies. And if you look at the over 400 companies, and if you look at their collective energy purchases, it's greater than the country of France. So that for me is a market shaping initiative with companies involved. But those individual sort of corporate iron filings, if you like, are starting to come together in a way that create a new magnetic field, which then shapes what other people in business and the financial world and so on think and over time do. And so I'm trying to find these examples, and there are plenty of them around. Once you start looking, it's amazing how many people have been working in this sort of direction. I have on Substack a channel called Rewilding Markets, where I'm just trying to work through the conversations with some of the people doing this, trying to understand what's working, what isn't, how we might do more of what they're learning how to do on our collective behalf.
Fantastic plug. We'll definitely be linking to John's Substack in all our materials as well, I should say. But I think the article actually on that point about other examples alluded to the Swedish hybrid initiative, the steel production side of things. So, again, another example that aligns with what you're suggesting there. But can I just take you back to you providing us with that example that you shared?
Sure.
What's the motivation for companies to sign up to that if it's not reputational and risk management associated?
Well, it is both of those, clearly. And if you're Facebook or you're Google or whatever, and you've got big data farms that are churning all of the sort of data that we're all wanting processed in all sorts of different ways, and that's consuming an enormous amount of energy, blowing a hole in all sorts of climate-related commitments that these companies have made, then you want to find a way of softening the impact of all of that on your reputation. And even in a Trump era, I think we're going to see that dynamic continue. And almost paradoxically, I think it's going to accelerate in the sense that people are going to put more pressure on the big tech companies because they're now seen to be politically engaged right at the center of. I'm talking about America at the moment simply because it's dominant in most of our daily thinking. But it's not just America. You see similar trends happening in other parts of the world. So I think reputational and governance and risk factors will continue to be enormously important. So one of the things I've been looking at, for example, is discounting. I struggled to think as an economist when I was at university first time around, which is why I gave it up. But nonetheless, economics is the master discipline of capitalism. It has a set of tools around and almost mindsets around how you discount things like extinction or whatever it might be. That's somebody else's problem. So I'm just trying to think, well, how might we handle all of that differently? Where are economists starting to think about some of that stuff differently? And, I'm doing it simply because I want myself to understand some of that stuff better. But by talking through some of that in public in a way, I'm finding people are sort of responding very positively, saying, I hadn't even been aware of that. And again, I think that's part of my role. Sort of it's a signaling and cross-pollination role in a way.
I think you refer to yourself, don't you, in your LinkedIn bio as chief pollinator at Voland. So I can it very much plays out when I think about your whole career as you've described it so far, John, and that paradigm shift that you alluded to that we're hopefully heading towards the crux point of. Let me ask you. We've touched upon. And I do come back to your filings analogy because I love that. We've spoken about, collective, response, if you like, of organizations coming together and agreeing to sign up to initiatives that they carry out as in collaboration. What about the other side of the coin, the government, the regulation side of things? Like, what's your view and take upon the role that plays in ultimately creating the systemic change that you've alluded to? And I'm really interested to get your take. It's a slightly different question, but there's that uncomfortable issue, isn't there, at the heart of sustainability and profit generation, profit maximization. What's your view on what future markets will look like in order to ease that that issue, if you like, between the two?
Well, I'm going to say something which I'll probably regret. As I said earlier on, Charlie, I was fascinated by history as a child and as a teenager and so on. And one of the things that I think I learned is that our economies and our technologies and our investment patterns evolve in a series of waves. There are up waves and there are down waves, periods of investment and disinvestment and so on. And in periods of disinvestment, the down waves, which is where we find ourselves now, I believe, you always get a major conflict. And I've been saying that to younger colleagues for years. And so when the first round of the Ukraine conflict kicked off, they said, "Oh, there's your war." And I said, "No, that's like the Spanish Civil War ahead of the Second World War. Doesn't mean that we're going to World War III, but I would say that within the next 4 to 5 years, there is going to be a very, very major conflict. I think Trump is part of pushing us in that direction, but Putin, Xi, all sorts of other people are doing similar things. The reason why I go through that is that no one should want war in any state or form. It's almost unconscionable. But somebody once described war as human species thinking out loud, very loud. And very often what you get at the end of a major set to First World War, Second World War, is an attempt to sacrifice a degree of sovereignty to enable the collectivity of nations to do new things, League of Nations, United Nations, and so on. And whether it's a major war or something else, which just takes us absolutely to the brink, at which point we, at least the sensible ones among us, back off. I love the idea of the UN. I don't think it's fit for purpose in where we're headed next. And therefore we need to do something different. Was that going to be China dominated on current trends? Very likely. Would that have the same sentiments and priorities and values as the United Nations? Absolutely not. It's going to be imperial. It's going to be colonial in a way that China and countries like that accuse the West of now, quite legitimately. But I think we're headed into an incredibly challenging period in our collective political history. But through that will come opportunities to drive properly systemic change, which I don't think exists in a time when everyone thinks they know what they're doing, because they just bat you away and say, look, just stop ventilating on these sort of system change issues. We know what we're doing. We're making a profit this year, and that's all our investors want. So it's a very complicated period we're headed into. Oddly, I feel both excited about it, and I feel actually more optimistic than I have felt in the last 10 to 15 years, because I think big change is now possible, but not necessarily with the mindsets that have got the sustainability movement and the circularity movement and the ESG movement, all these different components of the change industry to the point where we find ourselves. We've got to reinvent ourselves to be fit for that future as well.
And crucially, John, and that was so beautifully and eloquently put, the key, and I'm regurgitating back to you here, but the key is that we need to stop thinking in silos, and we need to stop thinking nationalistically, and we need to actually have an event which will lead us to more collective joined up thinking about the way that our international markets operate in order to facilitate a completely different way of viewing profit. And I think the article referred to competitive sustainability. Is that a fair synopsis?
It is, but the one thing I would say is that I don't think we're going to go to sort of a kumbaya, hallelujah, everything's saved world anytime soon. I mean, I've always been fascinated by science fiction. I read it since I was in my teens, and it's fascinating now to see major science fiction authors, Kim Stanley Robinson most notably, but many others, David Brin, others, getting into the space of climate emergency, biodiversity emergency, water, the water knife, an extraordinary novel in that sort of space. So I think the science fiction community is starting to give us clues onto what the realities that we're going to head into are going to be like and how we might cope with them. It's going to be incredibly messy, because anything that human beings humankind does tends to be messy. But again, and so to your question, I don't think this is simply going to be nation states coming together to do stuff, because that, I think, is going to get more complicated. You have regional alliances and so on. But the period of globalization that we've seen in the last 30 years, I think is very much on the back foot. And if some of these conflicts that I expect break out, and so they won't necessarily be exchanged to nuclear weapons. I mean, you listen to Putin, it's quite likely that they might be. But there'll be cyber warfare. There'll be all sorts of things that can collapse our societies just as quickly as a nuclear exchange might do. But so I just think we've got, as a group of change makers, to think very differently about the nature of the challenges that we face, the context within which we're going to have to tackle it, and the allies and partners that we will need to associate ourselves with along the way. I'll just give you one tiny example, which is, we've got this huge number, thousands of them, chief sustainability officers, really good people. I love them to pieces. I love what they're trying to do. But if I'm trying to get a sense of where a particular business or sector is going, I'm just as likely, if not more likely, within these companies to talk to the chief economist, if they have such a person, because these people think in a very different way. And it's that level of thought, that's a sort of systemic level of thought, that I think we increasingly need. So business has a critical role to play in all of this, We've got to be very careful that we don't end up talking to the people, among them chief sustainability officers, delightful people doing, God's work, to use an old term, but not necessarily quite yet seeing what's going to be required of us all.
And do you get that? Do you get that sense that we're, over the last sort of 5 years or so, that there's just been a lot of good chat within some interesting echo chambers. There's been lots of lovely events where we can all go along and tap ourselves on the back for the improvements that we're making. But this sort of significant change that you've alluded to here, this change of thinking, this change of framing these issues that we've got to play, this is going to require a completely different level of approach, and perhaps different actors that are involved in the ultimate decision making.
Yes, I do, and it will.
Brilliant, John. I could rattle on with more questions, but we have really got out of our normal timescales on today's.
Apologies.
No. I would love to just sort of completely break our normal structure, but let me finish by asking you the magic wand question, which I'm fascinated to hear what you're going to come up with.
Oh dear.
John, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
It's a very difficult question, and it's almost existential. And my answer that sort of springs immediately to mind would be, I'd give younger people a sense of hope that progress is not only possible, but inevitable. Because one of the things I see is, whether it's climate angst or whatever, younger people losing faith in politics, losing faith in the future. And I think that's extremely dangerous. In fact, it's deadly. So I think if I could do any one thing, and not spuriously, not to sedate people into believing that, as the world goes to sludge around them, it's all going to be wonderful, but to genuinely give them a sense that it is worth continuing working towards progress. I think that's going to be critically important.
And John, out of interest, have you come across any initiatives, any organizations, etc., you think are doing any particularly good work in trying to, instill and to cultivate that sense of hope in younger generations looking at these things?
There are a growing number of them, and some of them link students after they've left universities. Some of them are practical things, a bit like the old Peace Corps, where I don't believe in national service in the sense that you put people in uniforms and boots and give them a gun and send them out to police different parts of the world. But I do believe in practical, sort of community-oriented service for younger people, which brings them together with people from different parts of their own country, but different countries, ideally. And there have been people discussing ideas around sort of Earth Core or whatever. I think we need to get back to something like that, where we give people the opportunity, not just, this isn't something they're forced to do. They can elect to do this sort of service in different ways, but give them the opportunity to go and work on constructive regeneration projects, for example, restoration projects, with nature, with communities, with broken societies and conflict zones or whatever. Now, that all sounds rather grandiose and a bit far-fetched, but I think that's the level of thinking and that's the level of creativity that we actually now to see in the world.
And crucially, we're going to be in what you've just described there, which didn't feel over the top at all from my limited knowledge perspective. But you're going to bring people together. You're going to share ideas, which is obviously going to be core and fundamental. I think you alluded to the fact that you were hopeful about the engagement with younger people within this process and the need for that engagement. Well, if we can keep them inspired and keep them optimistic and engaging in new ideas with one another and sharing of ways out of the issues, then that's a hopeful future, if you like.
I think it is. I don't think we can impose that on younger people. No. I think we've got to look for people from that world who are actually starting to produce their own ideas and configurations of resources and all the rest of it, and support them and invest in them in appropriate ways. But again, I think it will happen. I think so. That's part of what makes me rather more optimistic than perhaps I should be, given the circumstances and the evidence.
Well, John, what a lovely place to finish things with. It's been a very optimistic and hopeful look at things, which I'm with you. I think that we need to be pragmatic. We need to be aware of the issues at play, but we've got to try, and we've got to keep optimistic about things. So thank you so much for joining us this morning, John. That was absolutely fascinating and a really enjoyable show.
A great pleasure. And let's continue the conversation outside the narrow confines of this particular environment. Thanks, Charlie.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to John Elkington, sustainability pioneer, author, and creator of the triple bottom line concept, for joining us. It was absolutely fantastic to have John on the show. John's vast experience and insights added depth to our exploration of Lindsay Hooper's FT article, ESG is Dead, Long Live ESG, and the urgent need for a shift towards competitive sustainability. Just a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.